Hi, this is Yvonne Galusha, and I'm your Visual Basic instructor, and I'm here to go over Chapter 14. And you should watch this sometime around March 7th. Before I get into the chapter material, I want to talk about some things that are actually kind of ramping up in terms of object-oriented programming first. They are introduced in this chapter, and I would very much encourage you to spend a little more time with this chapter because they've really packed quite a few things in there. If we just look at the programming constructs, it may not seem like such a big deal, but what's really happening in this chapter is you're starting to shift over to more object-oriented techniques, and they can be subtle, the changes, and then all of a sudden you're going to feel like, I don't understand what's going on, and it's mostly because you didn't pay attention to these subtle changes. So first, before I get into the chapter material, I'm going to go over these object-oriented techniques, hopefully carefully, so that you kind of understand what to look for and start understanding these things as they're introduced. So the first thing is this idea of a constructor. Basically, it's just a procedure, which we've already learned about procedures, where it initializes an object. But what's going to start happening is different variable types are going to be objects. So when you create a variable as an object type, you basically have to initialize it, and it just by definition on a lot of them they have to be initialized. So you do that by calling a constructor, and the constructor is called by using the keyword new, and that occurs typically at the variable declaration time. So in a minute we'll see some examples of this when we go over the PowerPoint for the chapter. But I did first want to just hopefully help you understand exactly what a constructor is and its role in object-oriented programming. So just to review again, number one, we basically are going to start using variable types more that are objects, and typically then they have to be initialized, and you do that by using the keyword new right there in the declaration statement. So the dim statement is what I'm talking about. Part of object-oriented programming, this we've talked about before, is that you access the properties and the methods with objects, and with us having more variables that are objects, we're going to start, of course, using this dot operator, also known as the member access operator, to designate specific properties that we want the values from, or we want to set the values, or methods that we want action to occur. Now the next thing is called method overloading, and this is what seems kind of strange. The book just has a short little paragraph on it, and so I tried to find a fairly simple example to illustrate the point. And it makes more sense when you start programming more complex objects, but when you just read the words, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And this example isn't necessarily object-oriented, so it may not make as much sense either, but I did feel like it was a simple example to illustrate the technique. Basically, overloading is when you create multiple functions with the same name. So here you'll see we have function getSum, getSum, getSum. All three of them have the same name. What varies is the number of parameters, or the type of parameters, or it could even be just the order of parameters are different. And so in essence, each function does something different, but basically the same thing. And as you get into object-oriented programming, you're going to see more often this method overloading technique, because it gets kind of strange to say something different on each of them when you really just want the getSum, like in this case. Now if you're not familiar with this line of code, this is just one way that you can write a single line of code with Visual Basic. Console is the object, so here you're seeing that technique to use the dot operator, and then here the right line is the method, and there are some arguments and it's actually calling the getSum. You can see here another thing I haven't talked about, but I thought this example would illustrate it. We're actually nesting these two. One's a method, but it's a function, and this one's also a function. So this is a nesting technique. So what happens is it evaluates from the inside out. So first, this getSum evaluates with the arguments 1 and 2, and then that result is the input argument for WriteLine. Similarly, you can see the method overloading. It's a nested getSum again, but this time it's got 3 arguments, and then again finally the last time getSum has 4 arguments. The code then would each be written as a separate function, and they're all inside a routine in this case. Or excuse me, they're not inside a class. I don't have that included. Here's the beginning of that routine. Then I've just got the separate functions. But if you were coding this with Visual Web Developer or Visual Basic Express 2010, you would be having these inside of a class. Anyway, so here you're just doing a read line, which is another method of Object Console. There aren't any arguments there. So the first function, remember with functions you designate value 1, value 2, and the type is as integer, and then since it's a function it's returning an integer. And I'm going to not talk about this by value right now. I know that you're starting to see that with the tool, but we'll talk about that in a later chapter, so just ignore that for right now. It just gets into more refining of how arguments can be passed, but I don't want to get on that tangent. So you can see here, in this case we have 2 arguments. In all 3 of these it's simply doing a simple addition, and then by designating the name of the function, this is another way that you can return the value. This is used like in VBA code if you're doing Visual Basic for applications like in Excel or Word or Access. It's a little different approach than what we did in class with the return, but I decided to show you this variation because you might be asked to do VB programming in a different IDE, Integrated Development Environment, and so you should be familiar with these variations. Anyway, hopefully you've learned a couple things here just in review. This idea of nesting, and then second, method overloading, and then the third thing is how you can return a value by just putting it into the function name as a variable. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about in terms of complexity with object-oriented programming is, again, starting to be introduced in this chapter. But it's kind of subtle. They don't talk about it much, but it can be a confusing point if you don't realize that this is the basic nature of object-oriented programming. So what happens is we have this timer control, and I'll show you the application here in just a minute, but the timer control is constantly running because we want the current time to be adjusted so that it's accurate up to seconds. And so what that means in terms of object-oriented programming is that you set up things to execute in parallel, and so that timer control is running while the user could be doing other things with the user interface, which would then cause other event handlers to run. So you end up having like multi-threading, that's one way to talk about it, or simultaneous events, or another way to think of it is execution in parallel. So just be aware with object-oriented programming that this is typical, to start multi-threading and setting objects so that they're executing kind of autonomously at the same time other things are happening. Okay, so now we're going to look at the application for the chapter. It's a little shipping application, and you might at first glance wonder, where's the submit button? What are you supposed to do here? It's a little different kind of application. But you will notice you've got this clock and it's continually running, and so this is based on the timer that I was talking about a minute ago with timer control. By the way, just ignore this display. It happens to be the way my resolution is, and I didn't bother trying to get the whole thing to display for the purpose of this video, because it messed up everything else if I did. So anyway, so that's one thing to notice. This thing is just there to give the user feedback on exactly what time it is. And so then they're going to use this new control that's also introduced. It's called the date time picker. And then you set it so that you can use this property of scrolling time. And notice what happens if I keep scrolling the time. Automatically the date and delivery time down here is going to vary, because it knows internally in the program some of the issues regarding shipping to Las Vegas for this company. So somebody just can quickly determine, like they get a phone call, when is it going to arrive, and they know when the manufactured item or something's going to be delivered or dropped off for delivery. And so then they could easily see here by this little application. So the event handlers are associated with this timer control. There's going to be a different type of event handler, and then also with these little clicks on the up down on the date time picker. You can see how it's causing this label then to change. Okay, so now let's go ahead and look at drill down into the new things introduced in the chapter. Basically, we start out with this new variable type of date, and dates can be pretty involved. I've mentioned that before during the semester. So we're going to look a little more closely at using the date property and methods, and then also seeing it in the context of shared members. Another example of overload constructor, and then the keyword new I've already introduced, but we will see the syntax. Then the date time picker control is used in the user interface. It can be customized. I'm not going to go over a lot of that. The customization just introduced how it's used. You can go over that on your own in the chapter. Then there's another user interface control called the group box. That is very handy for organizing objects. If you put things in a group box, then if you want those to not be visible, you can just make the entire group box not visible. So it's handier then to have it in your code if it's organized that way. The timer control I talked about already, so we'll have a little more information. And then we're going to learn about the form load event handler. This is something that's new but is often used in applications, and so we're just now getting, so we introduced that. This value changed event handler is what's used with the timer control. And then these last two items are just showing you some syntax that is a little different that haven't been used in other chapters, so I went ahead and highlighted them here in this as well. So date itself is a keyword. It's a variable type, and it's part of the .NET class framework. And they are used interchangeably, so that's a little confusing sometimes, either date time or date. I guess there's a lot of history as to why that is. Mostly it's kind of merging different technologies where one of them used date, one of them used date time, so it ended up when they got to newer releases they just used them both. They're actually more than just these 6 arguments to the date object. These are the 6 the book talks about, and for that, these are the 6 that we'll use in this class. But realize that there can actually be more arguments than just these 6. Excuse me, I'm yawning a little bit. So this table's right out of the book, where it's showing you the input values. So you can see here